Hello, I'm Dr. Beard, and this is an introduction to rhetoric. So, rhetoric begins in ancient Greece. So, today we're going to discuss the philosophers and one ruler that came out of this time period and established the legacy that is known as rhetoric today. We begin with Socrates. Socrates is one of the most famous philosophers to ever have lived. And interestingly enough, he never wrote down a single word. He was basically a wise man who walked the streets of Athens and instructed the youth. He did this for free. And his method was basically one of questioning. Um, this angered the people that were the other scholars of the time who called themselves the sophists. They were charging money to educate the young men of Athens. So you can imagine they were quite irritated by Socrates because he would offer his lectures and his discussions for free. They would just simply walk the streets and he would ask his students questions. This was what is now called the Socratic method. The basics is rather than to try to pour the information into their minds and give them knowledge through his interpretation, he wanted them to answer the questions and to discover the knowledge for themselves. So philosophy is the love of knowledge. Philo is love, and the Sophie part, like the sophist, they were knowledgeable. That has to do with knowledge. So love of knowledge is what philosophy means. And most college professors have the title of PhD. Many college students don't even know what those letters mean, but it means doctorate of philosophy. So at the very core, most professors are philosophers. They are lovers of wisdom in whatever subject matter they have dedicated their life of study to. So Socrates was a philosopher and he wanted his students to also be philosophers. So he would just question them. So for example, very simple example, what is love? And rather him giving a long speech on what he thought love meant or what love is, he would ask his students, what is the opposite of love? In order to understand what something is, you need to understand first what it is not. So you might would say the opposite of love is hate. Well, what does that look like? What is something hateful? How do you know what hate looks like? Oh, well, you can have some examples of hateful behavior, hateful language, hateful actions, and so on. And then you would be able to arrive at a conclusion for yourself about what you think would be a loving action, what you think would be a loving statement of words, what would you think is a loving thing taking place. So you can then derive a definition of love by first examining what it is not. So that is a very basic example of the Socratic method. And there's more terminology. It could be more in depth, but there's no need to go into all of the terminology. Just knowing the fact that the Socratic method involves getting your students or the people that you're working with to think for themselves, to have critical thinking skills, to answer the questions that are being posed so that they can derive answers from within their own mind. You can guide people, but you should not just try to put the knowledge into them. They should arrive at their own understandings through a process of questioning and thinking about these topics. So a few of his famous quotes, which we are only aware of these quotes because of one of his students, which we will talk about next. But three of his famous quotes that I think are relevant to the course material and to the subject of rhetoric. An unexamined life is not worth living. So he was about reflection, self-reflection, and knowing your own thoughts, knowing your own mind, knowing your own purpose in life, rather than going through life being told what to do. He wanted people to examine their own purpose, their own life. That brings us to know thyself. Very simple, straightforward mantra. But, how can we know the world? How can we know others? How can we be lovers of knowledge and wisdom if we don't even know who we are as people? So, know thyself is one of his most famous quotes. And finally, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. And this is a very philosophical concept, and it's very deep if you start to think about it. Socrates, you need to know the story of how his life ends to really fully grasp this statement. So he was walking around Athens, Greece, teaching the youth, asking them to answer these deep questions about life and the human experience. And he had quite a following. People loved him. They thought he was the wisest man in Athens. So as I mentioned earlier, the sophists who were paying for, or they were getting paid for their services as lecturers and purveyors of wisdom, they became rather aggravated by Socrates because the young men who were regularly their students instead were going out and walking the streets and gardens with Socrates to learn from him and his unique teaching method, the Socratic method. So they got together and said, "Hey, we need to do something about this Socrates guy. Um, we're gonna get him. We're gonna take him out because he's causing a problem for us." So they started walking around town asking the young men, "Who's the smartest man that you know? Who's the wisest man? Who's the wisest man in Athens?" And over and over, they would hear Socrates. Socrates is the wisest person in town. Um, so when they get to Socrates, they are angry and they say, "Everyone says you're the wisest man in Athens. What is it that you know that we don't know? We're the scholars of town. We're the instructors, the lecturers. What do you know that we don't know?" And to that, Socrates replied, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. I am wise because I know nothing." So if you pause to reflect on that, this is a mindset that allows you to be open to knowledge, to be open to learning new material, to having new ideas and concepts introduced to you. Because if you always think that you already know the answer, if you already think that you have all of the wisdom, you are not receptive to new information. You're not going to be as creative. You're not going to be as open to other people's wisdom and knowledge. And we learn from each other. So Socrates told them, "The only thing I know is I know nothing," which made them very irritated as well and angered them because basically he was turning the question back to them and saying, "Here you are thinking that you're the wisest people in town and that you know everything, but the townspeople think of me as wise because I don't pretend that I know everything. Um, I'm asking them to help me find the answers." And that creates a conversation that generates much wisdom. So it is a philosophical concept of how do we know what we know? What makes us know something? Um, if you think about it, most things we think that we know are things we've been told, things that people have taught us. Um, you know, things that you take for granted as knowing, for example, oh, the earth is round. You've been told your whole life that the earth is round. That's not to say, I'm not trying to say I'm a flat earther. I'm just saying uh, that is something people take for granted. But there's no way for us to know that unless we've been told. We've never been to space. We've never seen the earth from far out in the distance realms of space. We just grow up with the globe. We grow up hearing that the earth is round. Everyone tells us that. But if you think about it, it was not that long ago in history, just a mere 500 years ago, give or take, um, a couple of centuries, where this idea was even allowed to be discussed. You could be accused of being a heretic, and you could be sentenced to death for saying that the Earth was round, that the solar system is um, heliocentric rather than geocentric, right? The models of the solar system back then were that we were the center of the solar system, and everyone took that for granted, that that was just the case. So there's an example of, what you're told about something is what you believe to be true, but you have to really examine what are the things that really know because of your own personal witness to something or your own experience versus the things that you think that you've been told. Another example of this kind of perception of reality that can be distorted is, you can think of like a traffic accident. There can be a person standing at the crosswalk, and there could be a car, waiting at the stoplight, and then there can be another car on the other side, and there's a collision, and maybe you have four witnesses that see this collision from different angles, right? You have the person in the car that was hit, you have the person that was driving the car, you have the pedestrian, and maybe a person in the car, you know, behind one of the cars involved. They all have different perspective on what happened. So when the officer comes to ask questions, you might hear four different versions of what happened. No one knows what was going on in the mind of the driver. No one knows what was going on in the mind of the pedestrian. We don't know if they're distracted, if they really saw the whole thing. And often we all have a different perspective on events that happen. So, reality isn't as concrete as it seems. That's kind of the whole premise behind the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Going into a situation thinking that you already have the answer, that you already know, that it's already settled. It's settled. The science is settled. Science is never settled on anything. That's not what science does or what science is. There's a methodology, there's a hypothesis, there's experimentation. It takes a lot of effort to get to a final conclusion where something is set into law that is, known as something being settled in science. Science changes all the time, different ideas. I mean, people used to think it was a good idea to drain a person's blood if they were ill. That didn't turn out to be the case. Although, in modern times, there are methods that have to do with the blood and cleansing the blood, where that is something that can be beneficial, but just draining someone of their blood source is not going to be curative in most cases, as they thought back in the 1700s. So science changes, our perceptions change, people have different views based on their vantage points. So Socrates is known as one of the greatest philosophers of all time because he answered those sophists by saying, the only thing I know is I know nothing. There is true wisdom in knowing nothing. Or at least being open to the fact that you don't know everything. Well, they didn't like that very much, so they drug him over to the forum where they had a trial for him, and then they basically convicted him of heresy against the gods. And all of his followers that loved him so much begged Socrates to leave Athens. They said, we'll help you escape. Even the people, some of the people that had convicted him, that were involved in the trial, some of the people that were responsible for the execution process, some of them were even saying, this is terrible, we should not execute this wise man. But they wanted to get him out of the city. But Socrates said, no, I believe so firmly in what I stand for and my beliefs, and my methodologies, and who I am as a person, as a philosopher. I'm willing to die for the cause. So Socrates drank hemlock, which is a poison, and that is how he met his end, like so many other great philosophers. And if you think about it, there's been many in history that you can just go through time periods. Often the greatest, most wise philosophers, they are scorned, and they are often killed for their beliefs. And Socrates was an example of this. So that is how Socrates met his end, and we're still talking about him so many years later, even thousands of years later, literally. So how do we even know about Socrates if he didn't write anything down? It's because of his student Plato. This is probably another name that you've heard, Plato, the philosopher. His most famous work, or most widely regarded work, was the Republic, in which he starts to pontificate on the system of government in Athens. Now, Athens, Greece, in the golden era during this time period is considered the foundation of Western civilization. Why is that important? Well, if you have any fondness for individual liberties, freedoms, the right for the general public to have a say in how things are done and the laws, and the whole democratic process of citizenry being involved with the happenings in government. This all stems from Athens, Greece at this time period. Athens in this time was considered to be the first democracy. And what that meant was that people could vote for what they wanted the state to do. Athens was a city-state. It was powerful. It was an important place. They had neighboring city-states that they were in competition with, that they would war with or trade with. And in Athens, there was a democratic process. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. It wasn't a true democracy because you had to be male, you had to be a landowner, and you had to be a citizen of Athens to participate in the democratic process. But there was a sense of the average citizen being able to participate in government. And that had not been done before. So Plato begins to examine this form of government that was taking place in Athens. So he has the quote, "Philosophy begins in wonder." So he wondered if this was really the best method to have as a government of the people, by the people. In his opinion, Plato believed that it was not the best form of government because he thought allowing so many people to be involved in the governmental process, you would end up with mob rule, you would end up with fraudulent voting, you would end up with these divisions between the populace that would be cumbersome, that we would never get anything done if everybody has a say. What Plato believed was the most effective form of government would be to have a philosopher king, a benevolent dictator, if you will, someone who was a philosopher like him, like his beloved teacher Socrates, who would rule with wisdom, so that there would be justice and that you wouldn't have basically a mob of people making decisions. So to summarize what Plato thought about democracy is to basically say he thought people were too stupid for democracy. And we can leave it there, and I'll let you think about whether or not that is the case. So another quote that stands out for Plato is that the measure of a man is what he does with power. So he was concerned with the politicians that were coming to power in this democratic system. He could see the corruption there. And this is a theme that begins as far back as Plato's time, before the Common Era, all the way up, through the medieval times. Machiavelli, talked about power and the corruption of power. And of course, you can bring it up to 2023, which is when I'm recording this, and you can see that we're still having conversations about absolute power corrupting absolutely. So Plato was concerned about this. And this is going to come into play and be relevant when we discuss the subject of rhetoric and why rhetoric is important. Plato also says justice means minding your own business and not meddling with other men's concerns. So if you take care of your house and your situation, and I take care of my house and my situation, and I mind my business and you mind your business, and everyone is minding their own business and taking care of the things they need to take care of, he believed that is going to create a more just society. Virtue was very important to Plato. So being virtuous meant taking care of your own domain, your own situation before you become meddling and prying into other people's situations. So a good example of this is when in the democratic process or in society, you have people who maybe they're not very well put together. Maybe they don't have their act together. Maybe they don't really have their purpose figured out. Maybe they don't do things morally or correctly in their own lives, but yet um, they have platforms and they have agendas where they want to influence others. They want to make other people do the things that they want them to do. But if you were to take a flashlight into kind of their dark room and look to see what's in there, you would see a mess. You would see that their lives aren't together. Those are the types of people when they're trying to run things and make decisions for other people. We have injustice, we have problems because people aren't taking care of their own business and concerns. So this is also relevant to the idea of rhetoric. How are we going to be influenced by others? Are we going to look at their motivations? Are they people that we should be paying attention to and listening to run our systems, our institutions, and to determine how things go in society if they're not even minding their own business, if they're not keeping up with their own lives and their personal and private affairs, or even in their own business affairs. Um, are they virtuous? These questions will come up when we get to the concepts behind rhetoric and why it's important. So, as I mentioned, Athens is regarded as the first democracy, this golden age of Athens, when these philosophers were walking the streets and trying to come up with these ideas, these lofty ideas that we still see in effect today. We still hear about democracy all the time, particularly in the West, right? That this great value of the system of democracy that, we hear the word constantly, but I think most people don't really think about what that looks like in a pure form, which would mean everybody would have a vote and say in what goes on. Now, if you remember, I said Plato thought this was a terrible idea because it was going to cause mob rule, and people are just too dumb to make the decisions that need to be made. So what they had in Athens was the forum. And again, I reiterate that women, and they had slaves at this time. It was slavery, um, uh, which existed all over the world in all forms, and all different types of people were enslaved. Um, in Athens, particularly in Greece at this time, the preferred slave was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed slave. They preferred those people as their slaves. So it wasn't a racial thing back then. There was many different types of people that were considered in the slave class. But if you were a slave, obviously you could not participate in the government decision making. And if you were female, you could not participate. So it really was not a democracy. But there was this system in place where if you were a landowner and a male and you were a citizen of Athens, you could participate in voting and deciding, should we go to war with our neighbor? Should we, or, our neighboring city state, should we trade with this organization or group? Should we build new roads? Should we tear down this building? The bureaucratic decisions, the legal decisions, and even in cases of, neighbor against neighbor. They would come in and they would have a discussion in the forum, and then there would be a vote as to the outcome of what should take place. So, for example, um, there's two farmers. They live next door to one another. One is a very savvy, kind of outgoing, charismatic businessman, and the other is just a shepherd, quiet, maybe demure, not very outspoken. But the quiet farmer is a very moral person and a very virtuous person, just tries to take care of his flock and do the right thing. Whereas the business person, I'm not saying business people are always immoral, but he's a go-getter. He's looking for more opportunities. He's maybe a little less ethical, right? Maybe a little more seeking out personal gain. Um, the fence is broken between the two fields, and some of the sheep from the shepherd, who's the more quiet one, wander over into the field of the businessman. And he sits back and says, "Ah, I have more sheep in my herd. This is wonderful." So he goes and he quickly fixes the fence. Um, and then all of a sudden, his herd has doubled in size. Well, his neighbor, the shepherd, comes up and says, "Hey, some of these sheep are my sheep. I recognize them. They're mine. Um, I'd like to have my sheep back. They must have wandered over when the fence was down. I see you've repaired the fence, but I'd like to have my sheep back." And the businessman thinks, "Oh, this won't do, because now my sheep or my herd is larger. So I'm gonna deny that they're his sheep." He says, "No, no, these are my sheep. They've always been my sheep. I've been feeding them and taking care of them." Well, now you have a dispute, right? You have a dispute between two neighbors. So these neighbors go to the forum to sort all this out. And what you have is a very outspoken person who is a businessman, and he's looking for opportunities. So he likes to network in the forum. He likes to talk to people. People know him. Um, and he stands up and gives a speech. And he says, "This man, my neighbor, is insane. The sheep are definitely mine that he's talking about. He's trying to steal from me. I saw him the other day drunk, pass out under a tree. So he doesn't know what he's talking about." Now, that could be totally false. The quiet shepherd maybe never even had a drink, but it's all speculation. There's no evidence, right? They don't have iPhones, or, they can't take pictures of these things, record it like we can. But the businessman has a lot to say on the subject of why these are his sheep. But the quiet shepherd, he's shy. He's intimidated by the forum. This isn't his style to be, in the city. He's used to being out in the countryside, and he doesn't have any proof that he's not a drunk. He could bring a character witness, but he didn't do that. So, he just says, they're my sheep. I don't know what to say. The fence was broken and the sheep went over there. Well, if they go back and forth a little bit, the businessman continues to slander, continues to defame the shepherd. Well, then they have a vote. So unless the people actually knew the shepherd, they might decide they're going to vote for the guy who talks the most, vote for the businessman, vote for the guy who's really selling the idea that, these are his sheep. And then case closed. The poor shepherd loses the case, and the businessman's flock has increased by double. So because one could speak in public, one had a good argument, one had, he had some bullets in his arsenal. He had some points that he made, bullet points, if you will, while the other one wasn't prepared and didn't really have much of a case. You can see that justice has not been served, but you do have a reason to think about who is winning in these cases. The people that are right and that should win the case, or the people that just have the most rhetoric. And that's where we get to the word rhetoric. And you've heard this word rhetoric, I'm sure, in reference to political matters, but it goes much further and beyond that. Rhetoric is neutral. So the actual definition of rhetoric is the art of persuasion. This is where we get to Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato. So he learned from Plato, who learned from Socrates. These are like the trifecta of philosophers from the golden era of Greece. And he actually created the first, what would be thought of as a university, the Lyceum. He actually created, a place where people could come to learn, to read books, to study. So Aristotle was also concerned with politics, and he realized that in order for us to have a democratic system where people had a say, where the citizenry had a say in the government or the way things were done, whether we go to war, whether we have peace, etc. If we were going to have a say in that as the public, then the public needed to be educated. They needed to know what causes people to be persuaded. What are the concepts or the principles or the pillars of being persuasive? Because if we're going to have statesmen and politicians rising up to power, they're going to use techniques to convince the population. We know that now. Obviously, everyone kind of has the idea that politicians say what you want them to say. They give you a spiel about what you want to hear, but they don't necessarily stick to their campaign promises, right? A lot of it is to just generate excitement, to have like a tagline or a slogan that gets people behind this politician. And then once they rise to power, well, the rhetoric isn't maybe going to hold up the way it did on the campaign trail. They might completely change course, and they may never fulfill their campaign promises. But they were able to generate a following because of their use of rhetoric. So Aristotle thought, if we're going to have this system of government, it's not what necessarily Plato thought, that it was a terrible idea in the first place because people are stupid. Aristotle said, well, yeah, maybe people are stupid. That is a problem. So maybe we should teach them. So he wrote the book on rhetoric to try to educate the public about what means of persuasion are being used in these political forums that they were having, in these places of public discussion, the public town square, if you will. What are people using to manipulate the masses, to create a mob mentality? How do people generate that kind of following, or get people, rabble roused or rabble rousing to, yes, we must go to war with Sparta, or we must end the war, or we must build this building, or we must tear this building down, or we need new roads here, but not over here. How do we get people's interest? How do we convince them of doing, or convince them to do what we want them to do? So Aristotle decided, I'm going to write the book on that, and it's called On Rhetoric. A couple of his quotes that are notable, again, in line with his predecessors, in line with his philosopher teachers. He said, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. Again, a signal of wisdom to understand that, just because a book has been written doesn't mean the book has been written, right? There's always probably more to discuss. There's always room for learning more about something. And usually, if you think about people getting a master's degree or a PhD, doctorate in philosophy, they are going to not just stop with their becoming a master of something. Probably they're going to be lifelong learners, because there's always going to be new information coming along in whatever subject that we choose to be scholars of. We're going to always find more channels, more trails to go down, more paths, more pathways, more experiments, more developments in theory. Things are going to continue on. You don't just learn something and then it's the end of you learning all about that subject. Things change, evolve. The more you know, the more you need to know, the more there is to learn. So Aristotle passed on that tradition from Socrates and Plato, that I know that I don't know everything. So On Rhetoric, he also writes, the modes of persuasion are the only true constituents of the art. Everything else is merely accessory. So if you really dive into that quote, what he's saying is art in any format, whether it be public speaking, music, visual design, art, and all of its expressions, to really be powerful in any art form, you have to be persuasive. You have to pull on people's emotions or on their sense of logic. You have to inspire them because you're delivering the message and you're a strong messenger. Things that move us are persuasive. Things that make us make our decisions about our lives are persuasive. The people that inspire us in our lives, or that nurture us, or that help us move forward in our lives, usually are persuasive in some way. Usually they will persuade you, you can do it, or you have a purpose in your life. Maybe a coach would be a good example of someone that is inspiring through persuasion, whatever technique that coach may use. It might be positive, it might be negative approach, it might be a combination. I think coaches probably do both. They approach their team in a positive fashion to build them up, and then sometimes they probably try to tear them down to persuade them or to motivate them. Persuasion equals motivation, one way or the other. Again, it can be positive or it can be negative. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So persuasion is everything. It's all around us. If you look around, you're always being bombarded with rhetoric. People persuading you in one way or another, whether it be through a billboard or an advertisement on YouTube, or a YouTuber, or your professors try to persuade you. I mean, they give you information, but there's also an element of persuading you to kind of want to know the information, or persuading you to look at something in a different way. So you are always being persuaded. You might not realize it, so you might just fall onto the bandwagon of the latest thing always, because you're just going to go with whatever the current thing is. I support the current thing, whatever it is, because you're being persuaded all the time to get on board with things, right? You just might not realize it, and that's what Aristotle wanted to do. He wanted to make you realize that you're always being persuaded. And the persuaders often know that they're being persuasive, right? The marketers, the advertisers, the pastors, the priests, the politicians, all of the folks that basically run these institutions, these organizations that we're all part of in society, they use persuasion, they use rhetoric to get people in the positions they want them to be in and to get them doing the things that they want them to do. Social engineering is a real thing. It's a subject that you can study. You can actually, you know, become a social engineer where you get the population on board with certain ideas, you nudge them. There's a book about nudging the population by doing, ad campaigns or, social media campaigns, nudging people to go in a certain direction. And these are real things people do still. It's prevalent today, but it's always been the case that people have tried to persuade the masses to go along with things, whatever the things may be, war, peace, believing certain ideologies. All of that is the use of rhetoric. So if you're oblivious to rhetoric and what's happening, you might just go along with anything, the next best thing that comes up, right? You just go along with it because you aren't thinking about, hey, I'm being persuaded here. Rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So the subject of rhetoric is not just doing the things that are persuasive. It's not just being persuasive, but rhetoric is observing, the faculty of observing. So we think of our faculties as being our mental abilities, your mental faculties. And you think as professors, we're called faculty. We're supposed to have these mental tools, the mental strength of being able to examine, observe our subject matter, observe the world around us, and make good decisions, critical thinking. And it's not just a faculty thing. There's some faculty members probably in different places that maybe aren't the best critical thinkers. Everyone, just because you have a title, doesn't mean you know everything, especially if you have someone who thinks they know everything, right? Because then remember, you go back to the problem of thinking that you know everything. In my approach, I think you should allow students to think for themselves. I would never try to impose my belief system on a student. I might try to present my ideas. I might try to have people see things my way. But it's not my job to persuade you to think the way I think. In fact, I welcome you to think differently, because it would be boring if everyone thought exactly the same. But the faculty of observing, right? The mental ability, the tool in your toolkit to be able to look around and say, how am I being persuaded? How am I being manipulated? What is going on in this situation that's making me feel a certain way? Maybe I feel emotional. Maybe I feel angry. Maybe I feel inspired. Maybe I feel love. Maybe I feel hate. Maybe I feel anxiety or fear. All of those emotions are happening. What's causing those emotions? Or, maybe something's presented in a way that seems like, oh, this is a very factual, logic-based idea or a way of proceeding in a logical way. Maybe I'm trying to put together something like a piece of furniture, an IKEA piece of furniture, right? You have to always put that stuff together. Maybe I don't have my instructions. Maybe I am reading my instructions, but they don't make sense to me. So I pull up a YouTube video and it's someone who shows me step by step logically. Is that persuasion? Well, if I think the person's doing it correctly, then yes, I'll be persuaded to follow the things that they're doing to put the furniture together. But what if they don't do it correctly? What if I'm watching a video and someone's really not doing it right? And then I put my table together and it falls apart. So even instructions can be persuasive in a way. They can have a rhetoric to them, whether they're effective or not. If you're showing a step-by-step procedure, you skip a step, that's going to be ineffective, right? So you have to kind of look where you're getting your instructions from, right? Or, my husband doesn't ever read instructions. He's not an instructions guy. So he'll have something already put together before I'm even like on step 2 reading the instructions. And the instructions sometimes are hard for me when I'm putting things together. But it's like, am I going to go with him? Am I going to go with his way of doing it? Or am I going to go with the instructions, step-by-step procedure? Sometimes the case is he doesn't have to follow exactly every step. I might be mired down in the step-by-step procedure and he's already completed the task. So I can either be persuaded by the instructions or I can be persuaded by my husband who's already figured this out and completed the task. So I'm not going to say everything, but almost everything that we encounter in our lives has an element of persuasion. How you think about things, how you react to things, the ideas that you follow up on, the paths that you take, the food that you eat, the restaurants that you frequent, the types of shows that you watch, the type of music that you listen to. All of this involves persuasion of some sort, of whether you like it or not, or whether you're motivated by it or not. And all of this is rhetoric. So Aristotle wrote the book literally on rhetoric. And he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. He was Alexander the Great's tutor. Now, there aren't many people in the history of the world who have the moniker the Great, right? When you hear Alexander, you don't just hear Alexander. You don't even know his last name. You just know him as Alexander the Great. There was Catherine the Great. There's been several greats, but there's not that many. So you have to be pretty awesome, I guess, and make a big mark on the world if you are considered the great of anything. But Alexander was a student of Aristotle, and in this legacy of philosophers comes Alexander. He was not just a philosopher, though. He wasn't just a man of letters and thinking. He was a warrior. He was a leader. He was considered a genius in military strategy. He was known for his courage and his charisma. Charisma is a rhetorical superpower. If you have charisma, your rhetoric is going to far outshine someone who does not have charisma. And we can see this playing out now in public all the time with, movie stars, singers, and of course, politicians. I don't have a love for politicians. That's a nonpartisan statement. I feel like they're kind of, if you're in that position, you're probably corrupt, regardless of what team you pretend to be on. With very few exceptions. I kind of think that across the board because politics equals power, power equals corruption. Again, this goes back to ancient Greece. So I'm very skeptical of most politicians. And again, nonpartisan statement that goes for anybody of any political inklings but I guess do we need politicians? I don't know. We can have a conversation about that. That would be a good conversation to have. You can talk to someone. Do we actually need these people? I don't know. That's something that maybe people should go through the Socratic method and try to decide if we need politicians in society, but we have them, so we're stuck with them, I guess. But anyways, to have charisma as a politician is going to get you really far. So he was not only, he was a politician. He was a politician. He was a general military leader, and he had great conquests. He created an empire. What made him stand out or made him so important is he spread the ideas of Athens. He spread the ideas of Greek culture, the ideas of what we call now Western civilization were spread by Alexander the Great. That was called Hellenization. And that comes from Hellen, the face that launched 1,000 ships, which is the ancient story of the Trojan War, when Helen was married, was a beautiful woman who was married, and then she ran off with Paris, and started a big war. So that's just a very basic telling of the story. But in the Greek mythology, the Greek tradition, the historical record of Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey, he was just a bard. He was just writing down the stories that the Greeks told Homer. Not Homer Simpson, but Homer, the original Homer. And there's speculation that he didn't even do that he didn't even write the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're not even sure about that, but the story goes that Homer wrote these legends down, and Helen was the woman who started the Trojan War by going off with Paris with her husband. Whether she was abducted or not, people speculate still, but Helen is associated with Greek culture. So this idea of Alexander the Great conquering, all of the surrounding areas around Greece, he spread their culture, the Hellenization of the empire, Hellenistic culture. And that's that idea of spreading Greek ideas. His quote is, "I am not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep." Think about that. I'm not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion. So think about that. Think about what the difference between a lion and a sheep might be. And we've definitely heard about, people are like sheep. You can herd them, you can make them kind of go which way you want them to go. Are you a lion or are you a sheep? So an army of lions sounds scary, but Alexander knew that if you have a strong, courageous, lion-like leader like he was, and you have a whole army of sheep that will do whatever that lion says to do, you're going to have a magnitude of power. If you have a lot of lions, they're going to probably be squabbling, quarreling amongst themselves. But if you have a strong, courageous leader like he was, you can really make some moves. You can really do some damage with all of your sheep following you, who aren't questioning. They're just doing what you say. So great quote from Alexander, who was spreading the legacy of his predecessors, of his teachers before him. He spread that knowledge around in his empire that expanded quite large. He covered a lot of territory. So this gets us to the rhetorical triangle, which is what Aristotle basically wrote about on rhetoric. He broke this down. What is rhetoric? What makes us follow that lion? What makes us believe people or be persuaded or buy the product or follow a certain religion or follow a certain ideology or social movement? What generates inspiration in us? And it is the rhetorical situation. Okay, it's how things are put together in this triangle of rhetoric. So you have three concepts. You have the ethos, logos, and the pathos. And according to Aristotle, all these three things have to be at work for a message to be persuasive. And if one of these pieces is weak, then the message is going to be weak. Ethos has to do with the speaker and the credibility of the speaker. Okay, so you hear the word ethics in ethos. Ethics and ethos are derived from the same root, right? So if you have someone who's a scoundrel, who is a criminal and crooked, their ethos is weak. If you have someone who's like, you say, You see people providing medical advice, but they don't have any medical credentials. Or you have someone who's like Bozo the Clown who's going to give you the brain surgery. No, you're not going to accept a clown doing brain surgery. You want a brain surgeon. So ethos has to do with the speaker, all right? And whether or not the speaker is trustworthy, whether you can believe what the speaker is saying, has to do with ethos, right? So if you have strong ethos, you have strong credibility as a speaker. The next thing is logos. Logos has to do, again, the root, you hear logic. Logos is logic. So if you have statistics, you have facts, you have data, this is all related to the message. Are you giving me the facts? Are you giving me the information I need to make a good decision? If a speaker has no logic and no facts, no data, no reasonable ideas that are logic based, then you're missing a key part of the triangle. If you don't have a response to things that are logical, if you're purely just living in your emotions, you're unbalanced. Things are not going to always go so well for you because you are based out of an emotional position rather than having facts and logic help support your decision making. So logos has to do with the message being presented and whether or not there's logic attached to it, facts and data, research, evidence. Finally, the last piece of the puzzle is pathos or pathos. You can say it either way. This has to do with the audience and their emotions. So if the song makes you cry, if the speaker makes you angry, if you feel anxiety or even fear, all of these come from this idea of pathos, right? So a speaker can get you really fired up, right? You think of like a fire and brimstone preacher or a political figure who gets their whole crowd roused up where they're just like, ah, that's emotion. Okay, so this has to do with the reaction of the audience. The pathos is whether or not you're generating emotion in your audience. So the speaker has to have credibility. The speaker has to have some logic in his argument or her argument, and the audience has to feel something. You have to be able to give emotion. You have to be able to make people feel inspired to do something. And that can be a positive or a negative thing. It can be positive or negative emotions. If you think about it, the entire like cosmetic industry is based on pathos because, it's like you can be more beautiful. You can have the hair that you want. You can have the skin that you want. You don't feel good about yourself. So you should buy this product. That's making you kind of feel like you should be better. Like I need something that would make me feel good, make me look good. So I have this emotional response to the message, and then I go buy the product. So this is how these three things work together. And then there's a fourth element. It's not here, but it's also important, and that is kairos. Kairos, Kairos. Kairos is like the fourth element, and that has to do with timing. So there's a time and a place for everything, and a message might be more or less effective based on the timing. So speaking of timing, it's right up on an hour, and that is going to conclude my introduction to rhetoric. I hope that you learned something.